Welcome to the Mockingcast, the podcast of Mockingbird Ministries, an organization that exists to connect the Christian faith with the realities of everyday life. We come to you every Friday, and as always, I'm Scott Jones, your host. Today, we have, for the first time on the Mockingcast, Jacob Smith, who is the rector at Calvary St. George's Parish in New York City, which annually hosts the Mockingbird New York City Conference, which this year is April 14th through the 16th, and you can register at mbird.com. After we talk with Jacob, we'll be joined by CJ Green to discuss Another Week Ends, which is our weekly roundup post where we highlight things that anybody with a Christian, cosmopolitan, and grace-infused passion for life would want to pay attention to out on the interwebs. In the 17th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, we find a really interesting story where Jesus' disciples are approached by people collecting a religious tax, a temple participation kind of tax, and they ask Jesus if their master pays the tax, to which the disciples acknowledge that he does. Jesus asks a really interesting question. He says, when a king extracts a tax, does he take it from the sons or from others or from foreigners or from subjects? They, of course, acknowledge that the sovereign or the king takes taxes from others, not from sons. To which Jesus replies that the sons then are free. He then does something really curious. He says, however, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and yourself. Capon sees this enacted parable as Jesus' gospel critique of religion and religious institutionalism and the prison such things can be for people. Capon summarizes the meaning of this strange parable as follows. The point is, we haven't got a card in our hand that can take even a single trick against God. Religion, therefore, despite the correctness of its insistence that something needs to be done about our relationship with God, remains unqualified bad news. It traps us in a game we will always and everywhere lose. But the gospel of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ is precisely good news. It is the announcement in the death and resurrection of Jesus that God has simply called off the game, that he has taken all the disasters religion was trying to remedy and without any recourse to religion at all, has set them to rights by himself. How sad then when the church acts as if it is in the religion business rather than in the gospel proclaiming business. What a disservice, not only to itself, but to a world perpetually sinking in the quagmire of religiosity when it harps on creed, cult, and conduct as the touchstones of salvation. What a perversion of the truth that sets us free when it takes the news that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us and turns it into a proclamation of God as just one more insufferable bookkeeper. For my money, what Jesus senses clearly and for the first time in the coin in the fish's mouth is that he is not, thank God, Santa Claus. He will come to the world's sins with no lists to check, no tests to grade, no debts to collect, no scores to settle. He will wipe away the handwriting that was against us and nail it to the cross. He will save not some minuscule coterie of good little boys and girls with religious money in their piggy banks, but all the stone-broke, deadbeat, overextended children of this world, whom he, as the Son of Man, the holy child of God, the ultimate big kid, if you please, will set free in the liberation of his death. And when he senses that, well, it is simply to laugh. He takes a gone fishing sign over the sweatshop of religion, and for all the debts of all sinners who ever lived, he provides exact change for free. How nice it would be if the church could only remember to keep itself in on the joke. What great thoughts as we continue in the beginning of the Lenten season. And now, on to Jacob Smith. On the Mocking Cast, for the first time, Jacob Smith, the rector at St. George's Parish, right, in New York?
The Parish of Calvary St. George's in New York City.
Parish of Calvary St. George's. How can I get that wrong? I'm like Larry King, no research. One time, Jerry Seinfeld was on Larry King, and he said, well, I mean, what was it like, was it tough after the show was canceled? He's like, canceled, Larry. I went out number one. They offered me millions, and I went out on top. Oh, I mean, what's it there? No, big difference, Larry. All right, can someone get Larry an intern? Okay, yeah. That's how I feel like right now. I feel like get Scott an intern.
No, that's so good. Well, because everything that happens with Mockingbird happens at St. George's Church, as opposed to Calvary. But the two churches. There were actually three churches that were merged in the 70s. It was Calvary, St. George's, and Holy Communion. Holy Communion was eventually sold and in the 70s and became that notorious nightclub in New York City called the Limelight. And so just was a notorious nightclub. But the other two, continued to function as churches. And now our pitches were two churches, one parish. And so St. George's is the second oldest continuing worshiping congregation in New York City, where the Mockingbird Conference is. And it was started as a chapel of Trinity Wall Street in 1747. And what most people don't know is that it was originally the chapel of King George II, but after the Revolutionary War, you couldn't have that as the name of your chapel. So
that was a downer. I mean, it's a tough sell after the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, and so afterwards they dropped King and added Saint, and so there it is. So they're part of that history.
And your church is it's doing pretty well. I mean, especially by kind of mainline blue state urban standards.
Yeah, people are actually are showing up on Sunday, which is exciting, and it's new. It's interesting being a mainline church. It's kind of where, I don't know if you've ever been to New York City, but it seems like everybody from the South is decided to plant a church here in New York City. It's like Mordor, and they want to save it. And so, there's like kind of a built-in group there, like a lot of kids or whatever from Atlanta move here, and they want a little slice of home. So they go to one of those. A lot of the folks that are coming to Calvary St. George's are just kind of like either real New Yorkers or like kind of folks that are just like, what is this? And wait, are you saying that God loves the unlovable? Is that what, And so we have a lot of folks who've come and they've either tried to change New York City and it completely kicked them in the face, or they're failing somewhere, and and the gospel is a bit of respite. But most of the people who are coming into our church walked on glass to get there, and it's really powerful. And it's probably one of the most diverse churches in New York City. We have Caribbeans, white hipsters, homeless people. It's quite a sight. So, and
this sounds like a dynamic parish, and you're not using smoke machines.
Nope. Well,
there's no light shows.
Every once in a while, we do have a thurible every once in a while with incense. And that's
you have a verger?
We've just appointed a guy who's a sacristan, and so he helps us set everything up. But yeah, so
I was at a funeral. Yet. I was at a funeral a couple weeks ago, and this guy was the most impressive verger I'd ever seen. You wouldn't make a move unless he told you with the readers and stuff. And I had, and then after at the reception, he had like an Episcopal patch on this camel hair blazer. He was the quintessential,
that guy swallowed the whole enchilada.
And he's in theatrical stuff. He designs sets and costumes. He's like, this is off the rack, but I often make my own vestments. I was like, so if you guys ever need a verger, yeah. I would consider, coming up there once in a while. Definitely. And just keeping order up there.
Good. Yeah. So no smoke machines, I don't have a soul patch or, anything like that. So there it is. We just, it's just, law and gospel basically every Sunday and communion. So
just say old-fashioned word and sacrament, blocking and tackling.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Now, we want to talk a little bit today about the Eisenheim altarpiece, how it shaped your theology of the cross. what this says to in the time of Lent?
Yeah. Well, I first saw the Eisenheim altarpiece firsthand in 2009. I was a student at this thing called the International Academy of Apologetics, Evangelism, and Human Rights, led by John Warwick Montgomery. And,
Okay, you know what I said? Apologetics, evangelism, and human rights. You would think about apologetics, evangelism, Bible translation, apologetics. Okay, that's a very interesting. I like that.
Yeah. So, well, the idea being that apologetics, is the defense for the truth, and so since this is true, this should then, therefore, how we treat people is a fruit of the truth that we are proclaiming. And so the two were interconnected. And there were a number of guys who were lawyers who would take this class as well. But we went on a trip to see the Eisenheim altarpiece in Colmar, France, and painted by Matthias Grunwald, and it blew my mind away. I just sat there and looked at it, and because it is so offensive, and yet so brutal and rugged, yet beautiful all at the same time. When you really
and this is not small. This is not a small piece of work.
No, it's huge. It's like a 20-inch flat screen TV size, man. It's huge.
Yeah, and this is actually a replica of it hung on Karl Barth's desk. I mean, he worked under that.
Yeah, I have a copy of it in my office as well. So,
well, you and Karl, I mean, great minds think alike.
I know. So, yeah, it blew my mind away, and the reason why it blew my mind away is because in Colmar is this. First thing is that this was the first real image of a gruesome crucifixion. Everything else basically had Jesus basically looking all right on the cross, and then. And surrounded by Flemish maidens and Italian merchants all just kind of hanging out watching it. And this was the first image, real image, famous image of the crucifixion, where in the background is the Vosges Mountains that are in Alsace, and they're completely dark to highlight this brutal scene. And Jesus, his feet are just kind of clenched and his hands are contorted, and he is in real pain. And what stuck out to me is that this was in Colmar, the museum where this was originally an Antonite monastery, and the Antonites took care of people with skin disease and leprosy. And Jesus on the cross, the crossbar is bent, so it shows that he's not only bearing the weight of the sin of the world, but he is also covered. He who knew no sin became sin. So he is becoming one of the fruits of sin, leprosy, and the skin disease. He is covered in it as well. So when you look at it in real life, he's actually like a tinge green with these like red spots on him, and it's brutal. So here he is, and he's a leper.
Do you find I was at a presentation a couple years ago when the Rembrandt Faces of Jesus exhibit came here to Philadelphia, and they had a guy who was from Duke who gave a talk. He gave a talk about the portraits of Jesus throughout history, and one of the things I noticed was that they tended to be in two groups. There were ones that were highly symbolic and stylized, or ones that were attempting to be incredibly realistic, at least for their time period. So if it was a Flemish painting, Jesus was in a medieval Flemish village, but it was meant to be very realistic. And the Eisenheim was the only one I thought that was tough to categorize because it's realistic and yet symbolic and stylized, much like I think the Gospels are written, like with as realistic narratives, but with theological symbolism. And it just occurred to me that like it actually looks and feels and breathes like the New Testament in that regard.
Yeah, it is. Well, it's both a little of column A, a column B. So if you look to our left of the photo with Mary, the two Marys and John there, they both look very much like you would see probably a 15th century Alsatian, dressed like a 15th century Alsatian. And Mary is in all white, and both of them look almost kind of like in nun fashion, like they look like nuns, and then John looks like an Alsatian gentleman.
What's an Alsatian? What is Alsatian?
That's a great. Alsace is a region that's on the border. It's part of France today, but it was on the border of France and Germany, and was basically France and Germany's battlefield, and it went from back and forth between the two. And so where its capital today is Strasbourg. And it was an amazing center of both the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. And so
I bet you're great at Jeopardy. I mean,
yeah,
you seem like you'd be really good.
Well, I do have Wikipedia right in front of my face. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, okay. I was so impressive. All right. I'm editing that out.
Yeah, no, totally. But and then if you look on the other side, though, John the Baptist is there. And he looks like what you'd think of when you think of John the Baptist, and a first century prophet and biblical prophet in tattered clothes. And what's amazing is that his finger is elongated, and he's pointing to the cross. And in Latin it says, "He must increase so that I might decrease." And boy, isn't that telling? And doesn't that say everything about the theology of the cross?
And isn't the feast of John the Baptist celebrated like summer solstice when the days start to get shorter for that reason?
It is. It's celebrated roughly around midsummer, June 20th, June 24th, and it comes from that very idea: he must increase so that I might decrease. So after his feast day, the days get shorter until roughly around Christmas Eve, and then Jesus is born, and then the days get longer. And so, yeah.
I did not have Wikipedia open when I said that, by the way, just for our listeners.
Yeah.
So how is this shaped? We're a time of Lent, and I think, in my own experience, like there seems to be a difference between a theology of the cross and theologies about the cross.
Oh, yes, you're absolutely right. Or what I call negative theologies of glory, and this is the idea of kind of. The theology of the cross is what makes it distinct is that it's like the Eisenheim altarpiece, just silent. It presents the cross to you. And as like Gerhard Forde writes in that great book on being a theologian of the cross, says, that question that Jesus asks, my God, why have you forsaken me? This isn't a question where we get an answer to in this age. It's rather a question that by the power of the Holy Spirit we are drawn into to sit and wait, but where a negative theology of glory, or a negative theology of negative theology of glory, or kind of theologies about the cross, they're constantly talking and they're constantly making Jesus is in it, suffering with you. So it's these negative theologies of cross, like they're constantly, if you will, making excuses for the suffering, and trying to give an answer to the suffering, which is simply making speculations about God and what he's doing. And so as opposed to just complete silence, and this is what made the Eisenheim altarpiece so powerful, is that you were brought right before it as you were dying. And the Antonites were a silent order, so there was no words or anything like, this isn't God's fault, or, God must want you a little sooner, or anything like that. He always takes the best first. Any of that nonsense. It was just you were wheeled before, and you were invited to enter into that image, into that question, my God, why have you forsaken me?
If God takes the best people first, I want a piety check before I get on a plane. I want to make sure that I'm on a plane with very impious people.
But you know what I'm talking about. And this, I mean, it's just, it almost becomes, we're constantly trying to answer for God, and we're making speculations about him and why things are happening, as opposed to, this just is. And I do not have any word for you, but Christ has died even for this. That is enough. And but we naturally don't believe it to be so. We want to make apologies for God. We want to justify God, as opposed to just letting God be God and you be the creature.
Yeah. Do you find today, in certain contemporary theological circles over the past decades, there's been a lot of critique of what theologians call substitutionary atonement, or so they'll say it's divine child abuse or this. And I almost feel like almost just as bad are some of the more traditional defenders of substitutionary atonement because of the sort of rancor that they retort with sometimes. Again, it's sort of like it's defending a theology of the cross with the tone of the theology of glory. It's sort of it kind of creates a dissonance.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, as if like penal substitutionary atonement is like, the fact that you have to be atoned for. I mean, it like people talk about, I oftentimes hear folks talk about like the glory of God, and some of my, more like Reformed Baptist brothers always speaking about the glory of God, and all of this. And, on one level, like, you want to say existentially, what is that? But at the other hand, when people talk about penal substitutionary atonement in this negative way, like divine child abuse, you also realize that they have no idea what they're talking about either, because any real Christian theology that doesn't involve a penal substitutionary atonement is not complete, because Jesus is our priest for a reason. Jesus is our priest for a very reason, and that is to make atonement for our sins. And the idea that this is some sort of divine child abuse doesn't take into account like ideas like in John, where he says, "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down to freely take it up again," as if Jesus kind of was in some sort of divine accident. No, this is all part of it. But I think we can speak. To like we want to. The point is that we're always trying to get beyond the cross. And this is what the Eisenheim altarpiece won't allow you to do. So we want to jump over it rather quickly with theories of penal substitutionary atonement that get us quickly to the glory of God, which none of us have actually experienced, or we want to deny penal substitutionary atonement because that would mean that my life is actually that bad that the divine Son of God would have to come and die for me. And so I find that both are two sides of the same coin, trying to get away from the cross as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and Karl Barth in the Church Dogmatics, the way he summarizes the whole gospel story is the judge judged in our place. Because he says, you see what starts the human tragedy is our first parents want to judge what's good, what's fitting, what fruit they should eat, and he says the whole human story is us wanting to be the judge, a judge of the people, judge what's fitting. And he's like, in all the Gospels, Jesus is the one person who's a fitting judge. Like, he forgives who he wants, he calms us. It's clear he's the only one that has the right to judge, and yet he's judged in our place. And so the substitution is all over the place.
Right. Well, absolutely. I mean, that's the whole point of the first story every Sunday, the first Sunday of Lent. So traditionally, especially in Anglican liturgies, we begin with the Decalogue, which is the reciting of the Ten Commandments. Now, this isn't a list of things that you've accomplished over the last week during your Lenten fast. This is to reveal how far you actually are from God's glory. To carry on the idea. This is to reveal how broken you actually are. And the reason for the first story always in the first Sunday of Lent is Jesus in the wilderness, is to demonstrate not 3 ways that you can defeat the devil, but that actually when faced with temptation, you have one who has gone before you, and one who will at that more opportune time triumph over the devil for you, and has resisted temptation for you, so that, as it says in Hebrews, we might have a great high priest who's like us in every way, yet is not ashamed to call us brothers and sisters. It's a very powerful word. We do have a substitute, and that, I believe, is the key metaphor in the Bible. Our need, and he is our substitute.
He says no, right, in the desert to everything Adam and Eve said yes to in the garden.
Yeah, and the first Adam had an incredible garden with all he could eat, and the second Adam had nothing, and is in the wilderness. And that's very powerful because it occurs, especially in Matthew's gospel, right after Jesus comes out of what his baptism, it says the Spirit led him. So here he is, the new Israel, coming out of the waters and going into the wilderness, and for 40 days as opposed to 40 years, which then he goes into the land to conquer the enemies of God's people. I mean, it's all totally there. But we want to be careful that we don't jump too quickly over that cross, but that rather we journey with him and are honest about life as it actually is. And it's one that's filled with suffering.
Do you feel like Lent is a time like where maybe the theology of glory is the most tempting? Because it's sort of a season for some people of like religious athleticism.
Yeah, I always describe Lent as rocket fuel. Rocket fuel is incredibly useful when it's when it's used properly. It can propel you into outer space. But when it's used wrongly, as you've seen in the Darwin Awards recently, have you seen that? This guy strapped a giant rocket to his car, and he loaded it with fuel, and he flew so fast that when he tried to hit the brake pads, he completely exploded the tires, burned the brake pads out, and was killed as the car flipped and went into a fireball. So Lent is like
so he got that Darwin Award posthumously, I'm guessing.
Oh, of course, everybody does. That's what makes the Darwin Awards amazing. And so, because you're like, wow, there is someone dumber than me. But anyway, but that's what Lent is. Lent is like rocket fuel, and it can. And I hear it. So so for me, I used to always give up chocolate and soda and all of this stuff. And at the end of 40 days, I would say, I would completely deny it then. But looking back, I would say, look what I did for you, Lord. I gave up, as if that is something impressive in the grand scheme of things. Lent, in the wrong hands, feeds the old Adam and our need for self-justification. But Lent, when it's understood in terms of the Eisenheim altarpiece and the theology of the cross, should expose us and bring us, make us aware of our idolatry, our appetites, our lack of belief in who God has said we are hidden in Christ, and should cause us to fall on our knees. And as Luther says in that 99 Thesis, that the chief life of the Christian is one of repentance, and should bring us. So Lent shouldn't just be a season; it's every day of our life.
Jacob, thanks so much, and I really hope that our listeners take that to heart, and that we can have a Lent that's combustible in the right sense, not the wrong sense.
Yeah, well, this was really great, and I was glad to be a part of it.
And I hope to get up there and visit your parish in New York. And what's your website, by the way, for our listeners?
Yeah, it's www.calvarystgeorge.org.
Have a blessed Lent.
You too, and we'll see you at the Mockingbird Conference for sure, everybody, April 14th, 15th, and 16th.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
I got a pocket full of dreams, baby, I'm from New York. Concrete jungle where dreams are made of. There's nothing you can't do. Now you're in New York. These streets will make you feel brand new. Big lights will inspire you.
All right, back on the Mockingcast, CJ Green, sitting in for David Zoll, who is holding fast. Christ, he's at Christ's hold fast. What is hold? Is it a fort or?
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
It's always interesting to me when things are named things that I don't know what they are. Well, we're gonna get some research on that. I'm gonna find some answers for our listeners. So you have contributed yet another week ends, and we lead off, CJ, this week with a little Kanye. Are you a Kanye fan?
So I have my strongest associations with My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, which came out my senior year of high school. And I just remember the craze with that album. Everybody loved it. And I've listened to Yeezus at least once all the way through, and I've heard, a bunch of the other songs, but yeah, I was excited to see this new album.
Is your fiance a Kanye fan as well? Does she share your affinity?
I would imagine not, but it's possible.
Oh boy, I wonder how you guys are going to do in the newlywed game. I don't know. You call Kanye in this little blurb you have our greatest cultural antinomian.
Yeah, and what I mean by that is just that he yeah, every sort of cultural little L law or like standard taboo, what have you. He sort of has seemed to break those down with some determination the past couple years of his celebrity life. And I mean that mostly in his personal life. I don't know enough about music to like talk about whether or not his musical artistry is as groundbreaking as his personal life. But yeah, I mean, he's dressed himself up as Jesus and insulted Taylor Swift and been called names by the president and found himself weeping, before mass audiences. And so he's just kind of broken down all these little cultural standards that we have, which makes him really interesting to us because he does these things that like most people are afraid to do. But yeah, my point is just that he's sort of living in defiance of these laws, and that's not necessarily like the gospel part of him, but it is the part of him that's really interesting to us as listeners and viewers.
Yeah, I wonder if that, like, you see that in our politics too, that the people that are popular right now seem to be ones that defy convention in both parties.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. It's like the rise of the id, I think, was one of the Mockingbird posts. It's just like, yeah, the internal part of us, that just like the more like primitive part of us that wants to break the rules. But we don't allow that to come to the surface. It's like interesting when we see these other peoples on the stage doing that.
It's interesting too in New Hampshire. You could argue that both parties voted for, but the victors in both primaries were the guys who want to shake up the system the most in different ways. But in New Hampshire, it's got like the lowest poverty rate, maybe, and one of the lowest unemployment rate below the national average, and really cheap gas. Like, why do they want a revolution? Maybe it just is the kind of just anger and frustration with convention and things as they are.
Internal craving.
And Kanye's in debt.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, like 50 million. He's asking his fans to help him.
Well, he's not selling his album, so that's interesting.
It's funny that, people think that's so absurd, and on some level it is, right? But if you think of like, there's a book called All Things Shining, and in it, Sean Kelly and Hubert Dreyfus, I think they're both philosophers. They talk about rereading the classics, and they look at Greek deities and pantheons as like deifying human experience. So if you really find transcendence on the water, you call it Poseidon, or if you find it in nature, you call it Artemis, the hunter, or if you find it partying, you call it, Bacchus, the god of the divine, or if you find it in combat, you call it Ares. And really what you're deifying are these human capacities, and they're kind of, there's not one divine, there's all these divines. And I wonder if celebrities are not that for us now. There are kind of tribal deities, our pantheon of deities. So, like, I don't know, if he's like a celebrity deity, maybe it makes sense to ask for offerings from his worshipers.
Yeah, I think that seems to be correct.
So people that think they're more mature and sophisticated than polytheists, maybe we're not. We just worship celebrities.
Yeah, totally.
So you also have is this really interesting a letter that Justice Scalia, who, of blessed memory, God rest his soul, who in 1998, he was attending the funeral of a retired Supreme Court Justice, Lewis Powell, at a Presbyterian church in Richmond, Virginia. He wrote a letter to the presiding minister at the funeral, Dr. Goodloe. I think I know people that went to his church or have gone to his church. And he was really moved by the fact that the funeral focused mostly on the resurrection and not a eulogy kind of thing. And I learned a new word from this letter. He said that Scalia is, after complimenting the really faith-provoking proclamation of the resurrection that was the center of the thing, he says that I am told that in Roman Catholic canon law, encomiums at funeral masses are not permitted, though if that is the rule, I have never seen it observed except in the breach. That's interesting. Encomium means the praise of any person or thing. And says basically that, what really the point of a funeral, even of an admirable person, praising their virtues can cause us to forget that we're praying for and giving thanks for God's inexplicable mercy to a sinner. And that eulogies oftentimes seem to diminish that. And they try to make the person sanitized. Let's remember all the best things. And we lose sight of the fact that this is all about hope in the resurrection and mercy for sinners.
Yeah, those are just such powerful words, especially given the fact of his recent death. But just to look back on his perspective and to see that is just really powerful. But at the same time, like, yeah, you totally understand why people err on the side of focusing on the eulogy. It is consolation for the churchgoers, the people who sit in the pews, and sometimes it's a little bit harder to grasp the concept of Christ's mercy versus like remembering the good things about your friend who's passed. But yeah, I just totally respect Scalia's perspective on this, and it's just so powerful, especially like given the timeliness of it.
Yeah, and I liked your encomium about Kanye West in the post here. There was very much a thoughtful encomium there. I don't know if I'm using that word correctly, but I'm going to use that word like that's how I was when I was studying for the GREs. I just walk around and like try to, that's very J. June. I was trying to like use the words in my vocabulary. So I was terrible for like 4 months.
Such a good effort. Well done. And
last thing I want to look at, there's this chock full of other good stuff. So I encourage everybody to peruse. It's funny. Peruse means to like look at like very slowly. It's one of those words that I think people don't use. It sounds like skim it, but it really means I think it means to look deeply. So,
I always thought it was to skim.
No, I encourage people, don't skim. I think I'm reading it right. Don't skim. Peruse this baby with all care. But last thing I want to look at in summary is this piece about narcissism, an op-ed appearing in the New York Times this week entitled "Narcissism is Increasing, So You're Not So Special." And you kind of highlighted this.
Yeah, I think first we do have to make a distinction. I think there's a difference between like the narcissism that we would point out as like Mockingbird readers, that like, all of us to some extent are narcissists. And there is like narcissistic personality disorder, if I'm understanding correctly. And I don't want to like merge those two things together, but it is, I think, particularly helpful from a faith perspective to point out that, to some level, all of us suffer from the narcissistic epidemic, where it's like pretty natural for us as human beings to like look in the mirror and think like, oh, that's me. That's interesting. I want to know more about whatever that is, that reflection.
And you say here that,
and just with the availability of social media, we find that accelerated.
You note that like in the literal myth of Narcissus falls in love not with himself, but with his reflection. And so in the modern version, Narcissus would fall in love with his own Instagram feed and starve himself to death while compulsively counting his followers.
Yeah, which just gets to the concept of like self-justification, that you are driven by the need for love from other people, love and affirmation, I guess. It's probably a little more shallow than love. Yeah, we want just affirmation. We want to know that people are liking the things that we're doing or the way that we look.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Thomas Merton talks about the difference between seeing yourself and being yourself. That when you're seeing yourself, it's like a shadow self. When I'm thinking, oh my gosh, okay, how is this person perceiving me? Do I look like an expert? Do I look like a good husband or a good son-in-law or a good neighbor? Do I look like a good church person? Whatever. That instead of just being yourself, that seeing yourself, and that's an interesting metaphor and way to see it. But now, like our capacity to see ourselves is so unique, and it seems like in history of human culture with social media, because you really can look at you make yourself a self-object in a way that it's probably not very easy, was not quite as easy to do. You can always do the seeing yourself thing and live a shadow self, but the capacity to like fall in love with your image is unbelievably possible now.
Yeah, and with this increased capacity for us to see ourselves, the redemptive part of it is that, like, it points out the fact that we need to be seen as creatures. And so as creatures, that sounds so religious, but like, yeah, as beings, we need to be seen. And that's the role that God fulfills.
Yeah, I think, to be seen and heard and known, to know and be known is what we all deeply desire most. It's interesting because the way you get into the church and the renewal rite, baptism and Eucharist, they're two things you can't do yourself. There are things that have to be received, not achieved. Well, thanks, CJ. I appreciate you spending time. And I hope everybody peruses it. And I'm sure as they do, there will be much encomium coming your way by the insights you've provided us in another weekend. Thanks for listening to this week's edition of the Mocking Cast. If you like what you heard, please stop over to iTunes, give us a rating and a review. And as usual, you can find all the content we referenced on our website, mbird.com. Have a great weekend.